I don't recall how old I was when I watched Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, but from what I can remember, I must have seen a DVD of the film at my family's old house in Texas. Rudolph was my big introduction to the medium of stop-motion animation. Rudolph stood out because it was a style that I've never seen before. Not only that, but it was the first film that got me introduced to the idea of the Christmas tradition. The snow, the trees, the presents, elves, reindeer, Santa Claus. Of course, Christmas isn't truly about any of those things, but they are heavily associated with the holiday season. So much of my views on Christmas came from Rudolph. The older I got, the more I even helped relate to Rudolph. There was something about Rudolph that just turned me on, whether it was his adorable design, Billy May Richards' voice, or the fact that I identify with Rudolph when it comes to having a disorder. So I had a bit of a special connection with both the film and the character. Despite how successful and beloved Rudolph is, there seems to be a problem with the online perception of the special. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer used to be regarded as one of the greatest Christmas classics, but it seems like it's not quite as popular as it once was. And it's not just Rudolph, other stop-motion Rankin Bass films also seem to have this problem, which is pretty sad to think about given their status as classics. It does make me wonder if this has anything to do with the negative perception of Rudolph from modern audiences over the years. Now, tell me the plot of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Rudolph is a reindeer with a red nose that glows. Everyone, including Santa, hates him for being different, runs away to an island of misfit toys, battles a giant yeti, and returns home. Santa decides to finally accept Rudolph, but only because his nose serves some usefulness to his selfish benefits. The moral of the story is, people will hate your disability unless it serves a purpose to them. That, as far as I can tell, seems to be the modern perception of the film. However, if you actually watch the special in detail, closely examining details left behind by writer Romeo Muller and director Larry Romer, I feel like modern audiences aren't given the big picture. Not only were there some unanswered questions, but even certain character portrayals are up for interpretation. I'm not sure if this was Romeo Muller's intention, but we do have an early screenplay from late 1963, which is publicly available on the 2001 book, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, The Making of the Rankin Bass Holiday Classic. Here we get a somewhat closer look at what Muller likely intended things to be in his mind, including some dialogue not present in the final film, likely due to time constraints. This video is pretty much my attempt to clear up some of these misconceptions and misinterpretations that people have about Rudolph using official material. Essentially, this is pretty much the Rudolph equivalent to Mario the Idea versus Mario the Man, except this is Rudolph the Idea versus Rudolph the Film. Starting off at a strong point, we have the perception that the film is problematic, whether it's portrayals of its characters or the claim that the film is mean-spirited or sexist. Many judge the way the film portrays bullying, abuse, and sexism, which is understandable given its age. The online perception about the film being mean-spirited or sexist came under fire around 2018 when news outlets were mentioning it being problematic. It got so bad, even the voice of Rudolph's mother, Corinne Conley, addressed the issues with TMZ. It's been over 60 years since Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer premiered on NBC in 1964, and naturally, some elements that were considered normal at the time don't hold up by today's standards. This includes parts of Sam's narration, which reflects outdated attitudes towards women.
But Donner said, "No, this is man's work."
But they realized that the best thing to do is to get the women back to Christmas Town.
As well as brief imagery like the shot of the two Eskimos being blown away by the snowstorm, whose designs read as stereotypical today. These moments are undeniably dated, and in some cases, uncomfortable to watch now. However, they're minor, incidental details rather than ideas the film centers or endorses. While stereotyping can be rooted in harmful assumptions, not every dated portrayal automatically defines a work's overall message, and even so, it's fair to admit that some of these moments are pretty cringy in hindsight. Some folks even argue that the film is too mean-spirited or that it encourages bullying. It is a fact that the reindeer kids called Rudolph names, Comet refuses to let him participate, and Clarice's dad discriminates against him. However, according to Conley, the whole point of the special was to show that how bullies can see the errors of their ways, and learn to accept those who are different, and hopefully encourage any bullies in real life to learn about acceptance.
And so perhaps we're all getting a little more sensitive to it, but that's good. I don't think by getting sensitive to bullying that you want to copy it. You want to get rid of it. And certainly in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, everyone is reconciled happily at the end of the movie. And let's hope in today's society that the things that people are bullying about can also be rectified. And I don't think people are tempted to bully so much if they watch nice, warm-hearted shows like Rudolph. I hope they don't watch it. But if they do, they might learn a lesson.
This is proven in the climax, where the main characters return to Christmastown, where Sam narrates how after hearing the Misfits' story, they start to realize that they shouldn't have treated them so poorly, because despite their unusual looks or behaviors, they're still people just like them. In my opinion, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer is not a problematic film. The film depicts some problematic evidence, but it does not endorse it. The main characters were discriminated against and weren't treated very kindly, but not in the way that's meant to make the characters evil or encourage bullying. I see the film's overall message as what survives from the special's dated elements. Now, I would like to go over a few character details that I feel people simply ignore. The first one is the popular conception, Santa's a jerk. It started off as a satirical joke, showing clips from the movie that drive home the narrative, along with some funny captions that humor the audience. It was funny at first, but over time, modern audiences have unironically treated Santa like he's the villain of the story, which I think is a bit extreme. Can he be very cranky?
How can I eat? That silly elf song is driving me crazy.
Yes. Can he be a bit of a jerk?
Well, it needs work. I have to go.
Absolutely. But is he really portrayed as badly as everyone says? Personally, no. For one thing, he does actually show to care about the children he delivers presents to.
Oh, the poor kids. They've been so good this year, too.
It's been shown throughout the film that he's a bit of a workaholic. He's always busy doing something and doesn't like wasting time. Not only that, but his wife is always pressuring him to gain weight by eating purple slop. Wouldn't you feel a bit crabby if you were pressured to do so many of these things all at once? You know I absolutely would, and I'm a very positive, cheerful guy. He pretty much sacrifices himself all to make kids happy on Christmas morning. Of course, you could argue against it when he initially canceled Christmas, but I feel like it was more out of fear and uncertainty rather than being lazy. I feel like there's much more evidence that under his grumpiness does still lies the traditional jolly Santa Claus that most audiences expect from the character. Even whenever he says something negative or critical, he doesn't say it in a harsh manner. Not only that, but I feel like he was one of the earliest portrayals of Santa that doesn't always portray him as jolly. After all, Santa is human-ish. He could be an elf for all I know. It doesn't hurt for him to have a bit of an attitude as long as it's not directly at the children. If he were truly a grade A jerk like Gen X grown-up claims him to be, he absolutely would have been seen hating kids. Of course, we know Santa is a workaholic who's pressured by everything around him, but is still seen as jolly and joyful whenever things are going swell. He cares about the kids he delivers gifts to, and does everything he can to make them happy on Christmas. But what about how he treats Rudolph? He hated him for being different, right? Honestly, I was never given the impression that he didn't want him to fit in. In fact, aside from rejecting Rudolph from being a potential team candidate, he's actually shown to be much nicer to Rudolph compared to everyone else. When Santa comes by Donner's cave to see their newborn fawn, Santa refers to Rudolph as sturdy and smart. When he arrives to check on the fawns, Santa is impressed by Rudolph's flying abilities. Even when he scolds Donner, which I'll get to more in a bit, he even admits that he had a nice takeoff. The only time he's ever been remotely rude to Rudolph is when he demands him to stop shining his nose at him.
Yeah, Rudolph, please. Could you tone it down a bit? I mean, that nose of yours.
Of course, I'm not defending all of Santa's actions in the film. He really should have stopped the other reindeer from laughing and calling Rudolph names, but he didn't. I know he has more important things to do, but he could have at least told Comet something like, I know he won't be on my team anytime soon, but at least tell those kids to stop laughing at him and let him participate. And after he leaves, Comet refuses to let Rudolph join behind Santa's back. At least that's how I would have written it. When Rudolph returned home before looking for his parents, Santa was the only one who didn't insult him. He was the one who told Rudolph that his parents and Clarice were looking for him. If Santa truly was an irredeemable jerk, he would have been much more ungrateful for Rudolph's return. With all the evidence we saw in the actual special, and not my own interpretation, this proves that despite Santa disqualifying Rudolph from this team because of his nose, he does actually show to be more accepting towards Rudolph more than he's given credit for. Now the rest of what I'm going to be going over is up for interpretation. None of what I'm saying is officially confirmed by Romeo Muller, and with his passing in 1992, we'll never know what Muller's true intentions were when he wrote Santa. But I'll still use official sources to explain my interpretation as best as I can. With what I already mentioned about Santa and his relationship with Rudolph, if he's really that nice to him, why did he disqualify him for his nose? Well, Rudolph's nose shines so bright. Sometimes, it's bright to the point where it could even blind someone. Even Santa's reaction upon meeting him demonstrates how powerful Rudolph's nose really is.
Great bouncing iceberg.
Santa disqualifies Rudolph not out of hatred, but out of concern for safety and control, not just for the reindeer, but for Rudolph himself. Since Rudolph could barely control his nose as a kid, there wasn't any telling if he'd be able to eventually control it. What if his nose ended up blinding one of the reindeer during their flight? Of course now, we do know that Rudolph has better control over his nose glows as an adult, and having him in front of all the other reindeer didn't distract them. But at the time, when Rudolph was just born, it wasn't certain what his future was about to become. Now, there's a dialogue that Santa says that's also up for interpretation. When Rudolph's nose cap falls off, exposing his glowing nose in front of everyone, the reindeer kids all call him names. Santa, meanwhile, scolds Donner by saying this:
Donner, you should be ashamed of yourself. What a pity. He had a nice takeoff, too.
Even in the 1963 screenplay, it doesn't explain what Santa meant when he told Donner to be ashamed of himself. Many might argue that he's shaming Donner for Rudolph having a glowing nose, but I don't think that was meant to be Muller's intention, especially since Santa also comments about Rudolph having a nice takeoff. Santa says that he hopes his nose would grow out if he wants to pull his sleigh someday. He didn't tell Donner to hide Rudolph's nose. Also, he uses words like if he's going to or if he wants to, meaning that it's up to Rudolph to decide if he wants to pull Santa's sleigh, not Santa. Santa's not forcing Rudolph to join him, whereas Donner is forcing Rudolph to join him. You could argue that Santa is shaming Donner for trying to hide Rudolph's nose, or shaming him for not doing anything to stop the kids from insulting his son. Of course, this doesn't excuse the fact that he could have stopped the kids himself, and what I'm saying is still up for interpretation. But judging by the previous context we've been given about Santa, Donner, and Rudolph, I personally think scolding Donner for being a bad parent is much more in character with this version of Santa, rather than discriminating against Rudolph. I feel like it's much closer to what Romeo Muller was trying to tell with his portrayal of Santa. In conclusion, Santa is wrong, but not for the reason you're thinking of. Santa may act cranky towards his peers, and did disqualify Rudolph from pulling his sleigh, and he often prioritizes order over empathy, but his real flaw isn't cruelty, but inaction. He fails to step in when it matters most. Despite this, he doesn't have a personal grudge for Rudolph. He praises him to some extent, and the two eventually work together to help deliver the misfit toys around the world. What Romeo Muller does here is humanize a legendary figure without turning him into a villain. Santa is allowed to be flawed, overwhelmed, and imperfect, without losing the warmth and joy audiences expect from him. And that balance is exactly why he's one of my favorite versions of Santa Claus, especially his design. Of course, Santa isn't the only character modern audiences tend to misinterpret. Another common claim is that Donner is a jerk. This was actually something I once agreed with after seeing Gen X Grown Ups' video. However, after revisiting the story more closely, I don't think it's fair to label Donner as the outright villain of the story, despite how poorly he treats Rudolph early on. Many see Donner as Rudolph's abusive father, who shamelessly disowns him, and cares more about himself. And while I completely understand why his behavior reads that way today, I think Donner's portrayal as a parent is another example of Rudolph being a product of his time. It was a common portrayal in 1960s media where fathers tend to act harsh and authoritative to their children. Not to be abusive, but rather to enforce discipline and social norms. While not meant to be malicious, that doesn't excuse Donner's actions, but it does contextualize them. Throughout the special, Donner is shown to be egotistical and status-driven. He brags about Rudolph's potential and is obsessed with the idea of him joining Santa's sleigh team, without ever considering whether that's something Rudolph actually wants. In fact, Rudolph never seems to express any desire to pull Santa's sleigh. He seems to desire acceptance rather than Donner's job. Donner, as Santa's lead reindeer, desperately wants Rudolph to fit into that world. His priority isn't Rudolph's comfort, it's reputation and conformity, and that's where Donner fails as a parent.
There are more important things than comfort. Self-respect. Santa can't object to you now.
However, I don't see this as hatred, I see it as misguided protection. Donner isn't enforcing social norms because he believes in them, he's enforcing them because he's afraid of what happens if he doesn't. I don't think he wanted the other kids to mock Rudolph, or for Comet to exclude him in the reindeer games. Those consequences spiral out of control because Donner tries to suppress the problem instead of confronting it. If we were to go with the interpretation that Santa was shaming Donner for being a bad parent, then that moment becomes a turning point. It's where Donner begins to realize how deeply he's hurt his son, and he does explicitly apologize to Rudolph when they all return home.
And I'm sorry too, Rudolph, for the way I acted.
In the end, Donner's arc is about accountability. He recognizes his mistake, actively searches for Rudolph, and apologizes directly. Muller didn't portray Donner as a monster, but as a flawed parent who lets fear override empathy. He then has to live with it and correct that failure. He may not win Father of the Year, but after what he's been through, maybe he will next year. When people call Rudolph problematic or label Santa and Donner as villains, they're often responding to surface level discomfort rather than narrative intent. The same thing applies with certain details left unanswered in the film. Let's take a trip to the island of misfit toys. It's a place where toys that are considered abnormal live in isolation from the world after they were initially rejected. With that description, viewers will look at the doll and ask, what's wrong with her? Why is she on the island? But that question assumes the story failed, but in reality, it's asking the audience to think differently about what being a misfit actually means. In real life, many disabilities and disorders are invisible, meaning that you can't always tell if someone has a disorder by appearance unless they themselves say so. This is especially true when it comes to mental health or neurodiversity. In that sense, the doll is a misfit not because of a factory defect, but because her struggles are internal rather than external. You might think that this is how I interpret Dolly from Rudolph, but no, it's actually a confirmed reason for why Dolly was on the island. In 2007, in an episode of NPR's radio panel show, Wait, Don't Tell Me, the host mentions a then recent interview with Arthur Rankin Jr., where he confirmed that Dolly was abandoned by her original owner and was clinically depressed. The idea was explored in the 2014 Rudolph graphic novel, The Island of Misfit Toys. Dolly's backstory plays out exactly like Jessie's from Toy Story 2, where Dolly was accidentally abandoned after Sue's family moved away, and was rescued by King Moonracer, where she's brought to the island. I know some might dismiss this comic since it wasn't made by anyone at Rankin & Bass, but it's still an officially licensed book regardless. Ultimately, Dolly isn't on the island of Misfit Toys just to fill space. Her presence reinforces one of the special's quietest but most important ideas. Not every struggle is visible. Someone can look perfectly fine on the outside while still feeling broken on the inside, and that too can make them feel like a misfit. Another interesting detail about Rudolph that many have overlooked would be the fact that Santa's sleigh in the end of the film is being pulled by 7 reindeer, Rudolph included, rather than 9 like in the original poem. So what happened to the 2 reindeer? Who were they, and why weren't they pulling the sleigh? Now, the real reason we have 7 reindeer instead of 9 is because of budget and time constraints. The Japanese animators only had a certain amount of reindeer to use during filming, and didn't have enough to make up 9 reindeer like in the original story. So this is likely more of a production limitation rather than a deliberate story choice. But how could we explain this plot hole in universe? Earlier in the film, Santa tells Rudolph that he wouldn't be able to get the sleigh off the ground without Donner. Yet during the end of the climax, where Santa takes off to the island of Misfit Toys, Donner is clearly shown watching from the ground alongside his wife and Clarice. This implies that Donner was no longer part of the sleigh team and that Rudolph effectively took his place. This idea is further supported in the 1963 screenplay, where Donner is seriously injured. In that version of the story, Santa explicitly allows Rudolph to take Donner's position after realizing how valuable his glowing nose truly is. While this scene didn't make it into the final special, it does give us insight into how Romeo Muller originally envisioned the transition. So with Rudolph essentially taking Donner's place on the sleigh, who's the other reindeer that got shafted? Well, in the 1979 film Rudolph and Frosty Christmas in July, we are introduced to a reindeer named Scratcher, who was set to be part of Santa's sleigh team until Rudolph replaced him. Of course, the canonicity of Christmas in July is up for debate, since it's in a much more different art style and the fact that it's owned by a different company. However, assuming it's canon, it's possible that Rudolph didn't just replace Donner, but also Scratcher at the same time. Of course, Scratcher didn't exist in the 1964 special, so whoever that 7th reindeer was remains a mystery. But whether intentional or not, the reduced sleigh team unintentionally reinforces the story's central idea. Rudolph didn't just earn a place among the reindeer, he fundamentally changed the lineup. Maybe Rudolph's secretly the strongest reindeer of all the North Pole. The next detail I wanted to cover was something that's most commonly conceded by viewers, and understandably so. The elf killed the bird. On the island of Misfit Toys, there's a bird who doesn't have the ability to fly. He can only swim. In the current version of the credits used since 1965, the elf who was previously throwing presents down the homes was now giving the Misfit Toys umbrellas and throwing them down, all except for the bird. Many assumed that from the movement of the elf's hand that he threw the bird down without an umbrella, and because the bird couldn't fly, the bird fell to his death. Of course, in reality, this was only a mere visual gag. The implication isn't that the elf doomed the bird, but that an umbrella would be unnecessary for a bird. Also, if you play the animation slowly, it doesn't seem like the elf pushed him, as the bird started to move off slightly before the elf raised his hand, making it very likely that the bird himself jumped off. However, we do have evidence in the Island of Misfit Toys graphic novel that proves that the elf didn't kill the bird. Even though it's implied that the elf did push the bird off the sleigh, the bird himself admits that despite not being able to fly, he does confirm that he's able to glide. There's also a caption that says that Santa and the elves have great instincts when it comes to making things alright in the end. Ultimately, this moment wasn't meant to be read literally. It's a quick, slightly awkward gag in a children's special, not a dark punchline. Whether the bird jumped, or glided, or was pushed, the idea of an elf committed accidental homicide says more about how closely modern audiences scrutinize these films than about the intent behind the scenes. Though the idea of the elf killing the bird does make me laugh, I'll give it that. We finally reached the heart of the debate, the film's message. Modern audiences often reduce Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer to a cynical takeaway, that people will only accept you if your differences becomes useful to them. What started off as a satirical commentary slowly turned into genuine belief, usually without closely examining the film itself or the order in which the events actually unfold. If anyone actually uses MatPat or Cracked as a reliable source as to why Rudolph has horrible messages, that says more about them than the film itself. Let's go back and examine the actual film. We learn that Santa only disqualifies Rudolph from the team out of safety concerns, not bigotry. Donner tries to hide Rudolph's nose out of misguided protection, not shame. Of course, it didn't stop many reindeer from insulting or shaming Rudolph. Santa shames Donner's parenting, resulting in him realizing his mistakes and searching around the North Pole for Rudolph. Even when Donner refuses to let his wife come because, as Sam puts it,
This is man's work.
it could also be a way of him saying, this is my mistake, I need to make up for it. This was Donner's fault that Rudolph ran away, not hers. After Rudolph ditches Hermie and Yukon Cornelius, again out of safety concerns, he returns home after realizing he can't run away from his problems. But when he returns home, Santa tells Rudolph that his parents and Clarice were out searching for him. When everyone returns home to Christmastown to tell everyone about their story, that's when they all start to realize the errors of their way. From then on, they are now much nicer to the Misfits and accept them for who they are. I know some will criticize them for redeeming those jerks this quickly, but keep in mind that the story of Rudolph didn't take place in just one day. It took place within several months. It's long enough for a person to reflect over their actions. Santa realizes that he was wrong and promises Rudolph that he'll give home for all those Misfit toys after the storm stops. Note that I did not mention anything about Santa asking Rudolph to guide his sleigh, because none of this happens immediately after Rudolph returns home, only that he keeps his promise to rescue the toys from the island. It didn't mean he was going to put Rudolph on the sleigh team, and Rudolph still doesn't show interest in pulling his sleigh. It wasn't until Rudolph's nose started blinding Santa, was when Santa started to realize how Rudolph's nose was actually a blessing in disguise. That's when Santa offers Rudolph the chance to help save Christmas, and while many viewers jokingly want Rudolph to say no out of spite, he didn't. Rudolph's not a spiteful person. He's never shown spite anywhere in the film. Rudolph agreed to guide his sleigh not because he wanted to, but rather because he thought it was the right thing to do. He got the chance to finally help out, taking his assumed disadvantage and using it to his full potential. By the time Rudolph returns home, he's already accepted, not because he's useful, but because the people around him finally recognize the harm they caused. Santa promises to rescue the Misfit toys before he asks Rudolph to guide his sleigh. Acceptance comes first, usefulness comes later. Some may criticize Santa for not explicitly apologizing to Rudolph. However, what audiences fail to realize is that Santa giving Rudolph the chance to help guide his sleigh was the apology. At the start, Santa wouldn't allow Rudolph on the sleigh team because he worried that his nose could potentially blind someone, but having not experienced a storm like this, he realized how wrong his initial assumption was and offered Rudolph a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You see, when Santa finally asks Rudolph to lead the sleigh, it isn't exploitation, it's trust. Rudolph doesn't agree out of obligation or bitterness, but because helping others is who he is, the act itself becomes Santa's apology. And this isn't the film's overall moral. Throughout the video, we learn how parents are only human and still admit making mistakes. Even legends like Santa Claus can still be flawed without being a villain. Even Dolly shows us that your problems don't have to be visible to be considered a misfit. Hermie also shows us that your desires to do something meaningful will eventually pay off. But most importantly though, we learn that our mistakes shouldn't overshadow who we truly are as people. Modern viewers seem to talk more about the initial faults of the characters while ignoring their attempts for redemption. Isn't the whole point of Christmas is to make amends with those you have a grudge towards? Isn't Christmas about being together with many nearby and celebrating our successful achievements in life? Because if anything, Rudolph never had a grudge towards anyone, no matter how they treated him. Every elf and reindeer all came together to help work and spread Christmas cheer, even letting Yukon Cornelius and Bumble join in the fun despite their initial fear of the Bumble. That's why Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer has no real villain. Every character, no matter how much of a jerk they were, are still portrayed as likable in the end because they have such charming personalities that really shine near the second act. Romeo Muller taught us the importance of loving your neighbor, showing us how anyone, no matter their differences or mistakes, still has the opportunity to do the right thing and become a hero. And this doesn't just apply to Rudolph, it also applies to Muller's other works. Santa Claus is Coming to Town, Here Comes Peter Cottontail, Frosty the Snowman, The World of Strawberry Shortcake. All of them show that despite their dark elements, Muller tells us that everything will come out right in the end, even when it doesn't seem like it at first. He doesn't talk down to his audience, he challenges them as to why these problems happen and what we can do to help improve ourselves in real life. That is exactly the reason why Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer has stood the test of time. The movie tells us that minorities deserve more love than they are credited for. No matter how useful they are still loved at the end of the day. In the end, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer is a fun, lighthearted, family-friendly film about a young reindeer with a glowing red nose who's initially shunned by his peers. Despite that, he makes new friends, overcomes incredible obstacles, and ultimately helps protect those in need. The same peers who once rejected him come to realize their mistakes, make amends, and celebrate together. And when a blizzard threatens to cancel Christmas, Santa finally recognizes Rudolph's potential and gives him the chance to save the day. And as for the rest of the story, well, he went down in history. I find it ironic that a film about a reindeer that's misunderstood by his peers would also be misunderstood by modern internet sensibilities. I absolutely think you should do yourself a favor and watch Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I'm not saying this as a huge fan, but as someone who wants you to understand and interpret what Romeo Muller's intentions were. Don't just blindly judge the special by its memes and satire. Please go watch Rudolph with fresh eyes and decide for yourself where you stand on the ideas I've talked about here. Thank you so much for listening to my thoughts and feelings on Rudolph over the years. Making videos about Rudolph were always fun to make because they let me express my nostalgia and holiday joy to everyone around this time. No matter how much you enjoy my videos, or whether you agree with me or not, I still hope that you have a very Merry Christmas this year.